On the morning of October 31, 2022, the chill of late autumn wrapped around the Colorado foothills. The highway that stretched through the eastern edge of Fremont County was nearly empty, save for a pair of cyclists training for a weekend race. The two men pedaled side by side, their breath clouding in the cold air. For most of the ride, the road was unremarkable, fields turning brown, clusters of pine trees, the occasional pickup truck rumbling past. But at around 8:30 a.m., one of them slowed down and pointed toward a shadow lying just off the shoulder of the road. At first, they thought it was a bundle of discarded clothes. Maybe someone had tossed trash from a car window. But as they drew closer, the shape came into focus: legs, arms, hair splayed across the dirt. It was a woman, lying on her side, her body twisted in an unnatural position. Her clothes were dusty, her jeans torn at the knee, and her shoes half removed. Dirt streaked across her sweater, and there were dark bruises marking her arms. The cyclists froze. One whispered, "Oh my God, it's a person." They didn't want to get too close, but one of them carefully approached and bent down. Her skin was pale, her body stiff. There was no sign of life. They knew immediately she was gone. Pulling out a phone, they dialed 911, their voices shaky as they explained what they'd found. Before hanging up, they snapped several photos in case the authorities needed evidence later. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived, the morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the roadside ditch. The officers quickly cordoned off the area, keeping the cyclists at a distance. The body was inspected superficially. No gunshot wounds. No knife marks. Nothing that screamed homicide. To the deputies, it looked like a young woman who had drunk too much, wandered away from somewhere, and collapsed. That first assumption would shape the initial narrative, but it wouldn't hold for long. She had no identification on her. No phone, no wallet, not even a set of keys. Just a body in jeans and a sweater, sprawled on a forgotten strip of highway. The deputies noted tire tracks in the dirt nearby, faint drag marks as if the body had been moved. But no one dwelled on it. The county medical examiner was notified, and the woman was taken to the morgue. Within hours, photos of the scene began to circulate on social media. It didn't take long before someone recognized the tattoos: a small dove on her shoulder, a floral band on her wrist. Among the thousands scrolling through those images was a man named Omar Reed. He was the brother of Isabella Reed, a 27-year-old woman who had gone missing the previous night. Omar's stomach dropped when he saw the photos. He called the sheriff's office and told them he was afraid the woman was his sister. Isabella's story was not one of privilege. She had grown up in East Denver, in a working-class neighborhood where money was always tight and opportunities rare. Her mother had passed away from cancer when Isabella was in her early 20s. Her father was distant, more preoccupied with his own struggles than with raising his children. By the time Isabella turned 25, she was living largely on her own. She was raising her 7-year-old son, trying to provide a life better than the one she had known. She had worked a string of jobs, first as a nail technician, later as a waitress at a retro rock bar. The pandemic had stripped those jobs away, but Isabella wasn't one to give up. She scraped together what she could to open a small nail salon. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. It gave her control, dignity, and a way to keep food on the table. Friends described her as full of life. She loved music, classic rock from the 70s, stand-up comedy, and dancing on weekends when she could find someone to watch her son. She was the type of woman who carried light into a room. But beneath the laughter was a struggle. Bills stacked up. The weight of single motherhood pressed on her. Still, she pressed forward, determined that her son would one day have a future beyond the streets she had grown up on. Isabella's dreams were simple: save enough money, relocate to Florida, and give her boy a shot at a brighter life. It was a dream she spoke about often, as if speaking it aloud would make it real. As her small salon began to grow, Isabella's circle of acquaintances expanded. She met customers from all walks of life, some ordinary, some wealthy, some carrying a kind of power that seemed out of reach for someone like her. Among the new faces was Vanessa Cole, a young woman known for her magnetic charm. Vanessa was the type of person who made an impression instantly. She could walk into a room and draw eyes without even trying. She was warm, outgoing, easy to laugh with. But those who knew her longer described something different. Reckless. Unreliable. Always moving through life as if it owed her more. Vanessa's boyfriend, Richard Stanton, was even more intriguing. A businessman in his mid-30s, Richard lived in a high-rise apartment in Denver's Capitol Hill district. He had money, connections, and a reputation for throwing lavish parties. People whispered about his ties to questionable figures, though no one could ever prove anything. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who always knew more than he was saying. Isabella found herself drawn into their orbit. At first, it was dinners, small get-togethers, drinks at expensive lounges she would never have stepped into alone. Vanessa seemed eager to bring Isabella closer, often insisting she come along. Richard was charming, attentive, asking questions about her life and her son. He had a way of making people feel seen. For Isabella, struggling between bills and motherhood, it felt like stepping into a different world. Her friends warned her, "Be careful. They're not what they seem." But Isabella brushed it off. She thought of it as harmless fun, a distraction from her daily grind. What could possibly go wrong? On October 30th, the night before her body was found, Isabella accepted an invitation from Vanessa. Dinner at one of Denver's trendiest restaurants, a place where laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. From there, plans shifted. Richard suggested they all continue the night at his apartment. Vanessa pressed Isabella to come along. It wasn't unusual. Parties moved. Night stretched on. Isabella, trusting, agreed. By 7:55 p.m., she was still active on WhatsApp. That timestamp would later haunt investigators. Because after that moment, there was silence. No more messages. No calls. Nothing. Less than 48 hours later, her body was lying on a cold patch of dirt beside a lonely Colorado highway. When the sheriff's office released their first statement, they hinted that Isabella may have died from alcohol consumption. A tragic accident, they suggested. Another young woman who partied too hard. But Isabella's family pushed back immediately. They pointed to her bruised arms, the discoloration on her face, the drag marks by the roadside. Omar, her brother, demanded answers. Her friends flooded social media with memories of Isabella, her laugh, her energy, her plans for the future. This was no accident, they insisted. And as the days passed, new details began to emerge. Witness accounts, security footage, and a second autopsy would dismantle the convenient story that Isabella had simply drunk herself to death. What had looked like a tragedy soon revealed itself as a crime, a calculated act of violence hidden beneath the guise of an accident. Isabella Reed's story did not begin with mystery or scandal. It began in the quiet struggles of everyday life, the kind of life millions of Americans live without anyone noticing. For years she had walked a line between survival and hope, working long shifts, raising her son alone, and trying to carve out a future that didn't look like the past she was born into. To understand the choices she made in her final months, one has to understand the kind of woman she was and the burdens she carried. She grew up in East Denver, where apartment buildings leaned tiredly against each other and chain-link fences lined small front yards. The neighborhood was a patchwork of families doing their best, some making it, others falling through the cracks. Isabella's childhood was marked by two things: love from her mother and the absence of stability from her father. Her mother was the anchor of the family, but cancer took her far too soon. By then, Isabella was in her early 20s, old enough to feel the full weight of loss, too young to have the support she still desperately needed. Her father was never cruel, but he was detached, a man struggling with his own failures. After his wife's death, he drifted further, leaving Isabella to fend for herself. She wasn't entirely alone. There were siblings, half-brothers, half-sisters. But fractured families don't always fill the void. She quickly learned that if she wanted to make it, she would have to stand on her own 2 feet. That sense of independence became her armor. She never asked for handouts, never played the victim. Friends described her as someone who laughed easily, who lit up rooms despite carrying more weight than most people realized. But the truth was, behind every smile, there were bills stacked on the kitchen counter, nights spent worrying about rent, and a constant calculation of how far her paycheck would stretch. Her son was at the center of it all. He was 7, bright-eyed, and full of questions about the world. For him, Isabella worked long hours. For him, she kept going when exhaustion whispered that she couldn't. Every decision she made, every risk, every opportunity, was filtered through one thought. Would this make life better for him? In her 20s, Isabella drifted through different jobs. She worked at a nail salon, learning the trade well enough to imagine one day running her own. Later, she picked up shifts as a waitress in a retro rock bar, the kind of place where jukeboxes still played and people ordered whiskey with their beer. The work was tiring, but it put her in contact with a new kind of crowd, customers who had money, who carried themselves with a confidence she didn't yet understand. Some were kind. Others treated her like part of the furniture. But Isabella paid attention. She watched how people moved in those circles, how favors were traded, how influence seemed to ripple just beneath the surface. Then came the pandemic, and like millions of others, Isabella's life was knocked off course. The restaurant closed. The shifts dried up. The little stability she had built vanished overnight. But she didn't crumble. Instead, she scraped together her savings, borrowed a small amount from a friend, and opened a modest nail salon. It wasn't much, just a few chairs, basic equipment, and word-of-mouth clientele, but it was hers. And that mattered more than anything. The salon became more than a job. It was a declaration. A way of saying she wasn't going to be defined by hardship. She built a small but loyal customer base, women who came not only for manicures but for conversation, for the kind of warmth Isabella offered naturally. It was there, in the rhythm of daily work, that she found her footing again. But success, however small, didn't erase loneliness. Isabella had been single for years, pouring herself into work and motherhood. When new people came into her life, they brought with them the allure of something different, something exciting. She wasn't naive, but she was human. And when she met Vanessa Cole, she saw not just a friend but a doorway into a world that looked brighter, easier, maybe even freer. Vanessa was everything Isabella wasn't: bold, carefree, seemingly unbothered by responsibility. She talked about parties, about people she knew, about her boyfriend Richard Stanton, who seemed to exist in a league above everyone else. Richard had the money, the charm, the kind of presence that made people listen. To Isabella, who was used to scraping by, their lifestyle looked like another planet. She didn't envy them, but she was curious. And when Vanessa invited her along, she said yes. Her close friends noticed the change. They saw her stepping out more, attending dinners, laughing at bars she once thought were out of reach. Some worried. They whispered that Richard had a reputation, that Vanessa was unpredictable. But Isabella brushed it aside. To her, it felt like harmless fun, a chance to forget the stress of late bills and constant responsibility. And truthfully, she liked the attention. Richard asked about her son, about her business, about her dreams. He wasn't like the men she had known before. He listened, or at least pretended to. Vanessa was generous with praise, always telling Isabella how strong she was, how much potential she had. In that trio, Isabella felt like she belonged to something, even if just for a moment. But underneath, cracks were forming. Vanessa's messages became more frequent, her invitations harder to refuse. Drinks, dinners, parties. It was as if Vanessa wanted Isabella fully absorbed into their circle. Isabella, always polite, went along more often than not. What she didn't realize was that every step pulled her deeper into a world she barely understood, a world where charm and laughter masked something darker. On the day she vanished, Isabella posted a cryptic message on her social media. Just before heading to dinner with Vanessa and Richard, she wrote, "Are you going to miss me?" At the time, friends thought it was a joke, a throwaway line. In hindsight, it read like a premonition. Hours later, she was at dinner with them in downtown Denver, clinking glasses, smiling for photos that would never be posted. Later, she followed them back to Richard's apartment. For Isabella, it was just another night out with friends. For everyone else who would come to know her story, it was the final step into the shadows. Her family would later say she was on the edge of a breakthrough. The salon was doing better. She was saving for that move to Florida. She had been talking about new plans for her son's schooling. Everything suggested a woman building a future, not one unraveling. That made what happened next all the harder to accept. By the time investigators pieced together the fragments of her last hours, one thing became clear: Isabella didn't walk into tragedy blindly. She walked into it with trust. Trust in a friend who was anything but trustworthy. Trust in a man who saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be handled. And once that trust was broken, there was no turning back. What began as the story of a young woman juggling work, motherhood, and dreams of a better life was about to twist into something darker. In the hours after that dinner, in the walls of Richard Stanton's apartment, the story of Isabella Reed would shift from perseverance to betrayal. The question that would haunt investigators and the public was simple: what really happened in those final hours, and why? October 30th, 2022 was a Sunday. In downtown Denver, the city pulsed with life. Bars and restaurants were packed with people in costume, celebrating Halloween a night early. Streets glowed with neon, and music spilled from doorways. It was the kind of night where no one paid much attention to strangers, where chaos felt normal, and the unusual could hide in plain sight. For Isabella Reed, it began as an invitation. Vanessa Cole had messaged her that afternoon. "Dinner," she said, "just something casual at one of Denver's trendiest spots, a seafood restaurant that Isabella had never been able to afford on her own." "Come with us," Vanessa urged. "It'll be fun, just us and a few friends." Isabella hesitated. She had work the next morning, and her son was staying with a relative for the weekend. But the thought of saying no felt harder each time Vanessa extended a hand. So, as the evening drew near, she dressed simply: dark jeans, her cream sweater, hair left loose. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just showing up. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was electric. Groups of people laughed over cocktails, the clatter of plates echoing across the tiled floors. At a corner table, Richard Stanton was already holding court. He had a way of making himself the center of attention without effort. Vanessa sat close by, her laughter sharp, a little louder than the rest. Isabella joined them, slipping into a chair, greeted with warm smiles. At first, it felt like any other dinner. Drinks were poured. Small plates came and went. Richard asked about Isabella's business, leaning in with the kind of interest that felt flattering. Vanessa chimed in, praising her friend's resilience. The table was lively. Laughter, teasing, the kind of atmosphere where everyone feels included. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. Several witnesses later recalled that Isabella didn't seem entirely at ease. She laughed, but there was a hesitation in her eyes, as if she were aware of being slightly out of place. She wasn't used to this world of expensive wine and casual extravagance. Still, she didn't complain. She told herself it was just a dinner, just another night. Around 9, the plans changed. Richard leaned back in his chair, checked his watch, and suggested they continue the night elsewhere. "Let's head to my place," he said. "It'll be quieter. We can relax without the noise." Vanessa supported the idea immediately. "You'll love it," she told Isabella. "It's amazing. We can just hang out, have a few more drinks. Nothing big." For Isabella, the suggestion carried weight. Going to Richard's apartment meant stepping deeper into their world. But the pressure was subtle, not forceful. Vanessa's tone was playful, persuasive. Richard's invitation felt casual, natural. Isabella nodded. "Why not?" Outside, the October night was brisk, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. The streets of downtown were alive, people in costumes crossing intersections, taxis honking impatiently. The three of them walked toward a sleek black SUV parked at the curb. Richard unlocked it with a click, gesturing for them to get in. Isabella slid into the back seat beside Vanessa. The city lights blurred past as they drove toward Capitol Hill. Richard's apartment building was exactly what Vanessa had promised: exclusive, modern, with tall gates and a secure entry. Security cameras dotted the entrance, and a concierge nodded as they entered. Isabella had never stepped into a place like this before. The marble floors gleamed, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. It was the kind of building where people didn't just live, they displayed their success. Upstairs, Richard's apartment stretched wide, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The skyline glittered like a million stars. The furniture was sleek, expensive, every detail carefully chosen to project wealth. A bar lined with bottles of liquor gleamed in the corner. Music played softly through hidden speakers. For a while, everything seemed ordinary. Drinks were poured again, laughter resurfaced, and Isabella allowed herself to settle in. But there were cracks. Vanessa, after several glasses of wine, grew sharper in tone. Her comments toward Isabella had an edge, sarcasm disguised as jokes, jabs about her small business, her ordinary life. Richard smoothed things over with a chuckle, but the tension hung in the air. By 7:55 p.m., Isabella's phone registered its last activity. A quick message, a simple check-in. Then silence. Friends who had been texting her that evening noticed when the replies stopped. They brushed it off at first. People get busy, they thought. Phones die. But later, those missing replies would loom large. Inside the apartment, the evenings stretched on. The details of what happened between those walls remain contested. Fragments from phone records, inconsistencies in Vanessa's later statements, silence from Richard himself. What is known is that others who had been there earlier left around 7:45. By then, Isabella, Vanessa, and Richard were the only ones remaining. What followed was the beginning of the end. Some neighbors later recalled faint sounds, raised voices, a thud, but nothing distinct enough to call the police. It was a Sunday night in a city filled with noise. No one thought twice. The next morning, security cameras in the building's garage would capture Richard Stanton walking to his SUV. The time stamp read 10:27 a.m. He moved calmly, without panic, as if performing a routine errand. But in the footage, his arms carried more than groceries. Draped in his grip was the limp body of Isabella Reed. He placed her in the vehicle, adjusted his jacket, and drove out of the garage. At that moment, Isabella ceased being a missing friend or a concerned family member's unanswered call. She became the centerpiece of a crime, her story rewritten not by her own words, but by the lies that were about to follow. In the hours to come, Richard and Vanessa would tell a version of events that painted Isabella as unstable, as drunk, as someone who left on her own. They would claim she had called a taxi, that she had walked away alive. But the camera did not lie. And once investigators obtained that footage, their carefully constructed story would unravel piece by piece. For now, on that Halloween morning, all anyone knew was that a young woman had been found on the side of a highway. But behind the closed doors of Richard Stanton's apartment, the truth of how she ended up there was sealed in silence, waiting to be uncovered. When the sheriff's office in Fremont County first addressed the discovery of Isabella Reed's body, the words they chose seemed carefully neutral. They hinted at alcohol, at the possibility of an accident. They told the press there were no obvious signs of trauma. To them, it was easier to believe she had simply collapsed after a night of drinking than to admit something darker might be hiding underneath. But her family knew better. Omar Reed, who had identified his sister by the tattoos on her body, had seen the bruises with his own eyes. Purple marks across her arms, discoloration on her face, abrasions that couldn't be explained away by a stumble. She didn't just fall, he told anyone who would listen. Someone hurt her. At first, it felt like no one was listening. The official autopsy released just days later seemed to back the accident theory. The report stated Isabella had likely died from aspiration, choking on vomit while intoxicated. It was clinical, detached, and to her family, insulting. They knew Isabella enjoyed a drink now and then, but this? To suggest she had drunk herself into oblivion, wandered to the edge of a highway, and collapsed, it didn't fit. Meanwhile, friends who had been with her earlier in the evening were already talking. They remembered Isabella leaving with Vanessa and Richard. Some said she seemed hesitant, that Vanessa had coaxed her into going along. Others noticed Richard's charm, his way of putting everyone at ease. None of them believed she had simply walked away from that apartment and vanished. The first inconsistency came almost immediately. Richard Stanton, when questioned, claimed Isabella had left his apartment of her own accord. He told deputies she called a taxi, that he walked her to the door, and watched her leave. Vanessa backed up his story. She was upset, Vanessa said vaguely, but she left on her own. It sounded plausible enough, until investigators checked the taxi records. Several drivers had been dispatched to the area that night. Not one reported picking up a woman matching Isabella's description. The building's security logs showed no evidence of a rideshare driver entering. There was nothing. Vanessa's story began to shift. At first, she said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. Later, she admitted there had been a small disagreement between her and Isabella earlier in the evening. She said Isabella seemed emotional, that she might have left because of it. To police, the contradiction was small but telling. Witnesses who tell the truth rarely change their stories so quickly. Isabella's friends were also receiving strange messages from Vanessa in the hours after her disappearance. She downplayed the situation, telling them Isabella was probably fine, that maybe she had gone off to cool down. At one point, she even suggested Isabella could have harmed herself, referencing a cryptic social media post Isabella had made earlier that day. "Are you going to miss me?" To Vanessa, it became a convenient excuse. To investigators, it was a red flag. The pressure grew. Family members refused to accept the official narrative, flooding social media with photos of Isabella, demanding justice. Posts spread rapidly, gathering support from advocacy groups who saw her death as part of a wider pattern, another young woman whose story risked being erased by indifference. That pressure worked. The case was transferred from Fremont County to Denver authorities, who ordered a second, independent autopsy. When the results came back, they dismantled the original story. Isabella had not died from aspiration. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, injuries that could not have come from simply falling. Her arms and legs bore defensive wounds, bruises consistent with someone fighting back. This was not an accident. It was homicide. The revelation changed everything. Publicly, authorities had no choice but to admit the truth. Privately, suspicions grew about why the Fremont County report had been so dismissive. Was it incompetence? Or something else? Pressure from someone with influence, someone who wanted the story buried before it began? For Richard Stanton, the evidence was closing in. Investigators seized his phone, along with Vanessa's. What they found painted a picture very different from the casual stories he had told. There were messages between the two in the days after Isabella's disappearance, messages about keeping their story straight, about how to respond to questions. Vanessa had written that she was worried the family's persistence would draw too much attention. Richard replied, "Don't worry. It's under control." Then came the most damning piece of all, surveillance footage from the garage of Richard's apartment building. The timestamp read 10:27 a.m., October 31st, the morning after Isabella was last seen alive. The footage showed Richard walking to his SUV. His stride was steady, deliberate. And in his arms was Isabella's lifeless body. Investigators watched in silence as he placed her in the vehicle, adjusted his jacket, and drove out of the garage. There was no sign of panic. No call to emergency services. No attempt to get help. Just cold, quiet concealment. The discovery left no room for doubt. Richard hadn't merely let her leave. He had carried her out himself. When confronted with the footage, Richard changed his story. He claimed he had found Isabella unresponsive in his apartment that morning. Afraid of being blamed, he panicked, he said. He thought no one would believe him if he called the police. So, he decided to move her body, leaving it by the highway to make it look like an accident. It was a story designed to sound desperate but not violent. Yet the second autopsy had already revealed otherwise. Isabella hadn't simply collapsed. She had been beaten. Meanwhile, Vanessa's behavior became even more suspicious. She deleted photos, erased messages, tried to scrub her phone clean. But digital trails linger, and investigators pieced together enough to show she knew far more than she admitted. She had been in constant contact with Richard, strategizing, aligning their statements. At one point, she even wrote to him that they needed proof Isabella had left alive, like a video or a photo. The words spoke for themselves. By now, the narrative had shifted entirely. What began as whispers of an accident was now recognized for what it was, a cover-up. The charming businessman and his magnetic girlfriend were no longer just party hosts. They were suspects in a homicide investigation. Still, the question lingered. Why had Fremont County been so quick to dismiss Isabella's death? Why had evidence of trauma been ignored? Whispers grew about Richard's connections, his family's businesses, the influence they wielded behind the scenes. The possibility of corruption became impossible to ignore. For Isabella's family, the revelations brought both validation and heartbreak. They had been right all along. She hadn't died by her own hand. But knowing she had fought back, knowing the violence she endured, made the loss all the harder. Omar said it plainly, she trusted them. They betrayed her. The cracks in Richard and Vanessa's story were widening into fractures. And once the surveillance footage was released to the public, there would be no turning back. The mask of respectability had slipped. The world could now see what Isabella's family had known from the start. Her death was no accident. By the second week of November 2022, the story of Isabella Reed had spread far beyond Denver. At first, it had been a local tragedy, a young woman found dead on the side of a Colorado highway. But as details surfaced, the shifting statements, the second autopsy, the surveillance footage, the case became national news. For the Reed family, the shift was both a relief and a torment. Relief that the world now saw what they had been screaming from the beginning. Isabella had been murdered. Torment, because each new revelation painted a darker picture of her final hours. The surveillance video was the tipping point. When local journalists got hold of the footage and described what it showed, outrage exploded. Talk shows debated it, advocacy groups rallied around Isabella's name, and the sheriff's office, once accused of negligence, was forced into the spotlight. There was no hiding anymore. Richard Stanton's reputation, once carefully polished, began to crack. Business associates stopped returning calls. Clients pulled away. The image of the confident, charming entrepreneur no longer held. Instead, the public saw what investigators had been piecing together. A man who carried a young woman's lifeless body out of his luxury apartment and tried to hide it under the morning sun. Vanessa Cole didn't fare better. Text messages between her and Richard were leaked, showing how they had worked together to coordinate their stories. "We need to stay consistent," one read. Another, "Don't say too much, just let me handle it." To the public, it was proof she hadn't just been a bystander. She had been part of the deception. Investigators, now under pressure, reopened every angle. They searched Richard's apartment again, this time with more thoroughness. Traces of blood were found on the living room rug and near the bar counter. Dina confirmed it was Isabella's. There was no longer any doubt. She had been harmed inside that apartment. Vanessa was the first to be arrested. It happened in the middle of the day, outside a cafe where she had been meeting a friend. Cameras caught the moment, officers leading her away, her expression a mix of shock and defiance. For Isabella's family, it was the first real sign of accountability. Richard followed days later, though his arrest looked different. Surrounded by lawyers, he surrendered himself at a downtown precinct. To the cameras, he appeared calm, even smug. "I'm innocent," he told reporters. This has been blown out of proportion. But the evidence told another story. Inside interrogation rooms, their accounts fractured further. Richard clung to his version, that Isabella had died on her own, that he panicked and made a terrible decision. But when investigators pressed him about the bruises, about the head trauma, he had no answers. Vanessa, meanwhile, insisted she had gone to bed early, too drunk to remember what happened. Phone records contradicted her. She had been texting Richard late into the night, her words clear, not slurred, planning what to say. The public reaction was relentless. Vigils were held in Denver, candles lit for Isabella, her son's photo placed among flowers and signs demanding justice. Online, her name trended for weeks. Activists pointed out that if not for the family's persistence and the second autopsy, her case might have been written off as an accident. How many others, they asked, never get that chance? The pressure didn't just fall on Richard and Vanessa. It fell on the Fremont County officials who had overseen the first autopsy. Why had signs of trauma been ignored? Why had the bruises been downplayed? The county coroner insisted it had been a mistake, but few believed it. Whispers spread of Richard's connections, business ties, family influence, friendships with people in positions of power. By December, the Colorado Attorney General announced an internal investigation into possible misconduct. The public wanted to know if Isabella's death had almost been buried not just by her killers, but by the very system meant to protect her. In court filings, prosecutors laid out the case. Isabella had suffered blunt force trauma. Her body had been moved. Evidence had been deliberately concealed. Richard and Vanessa weren't just guilty of poor judgment, they were guilty of covering up a violent crime. Charges of homicide and tampering with evidence were filed. The term femicide, a word that carried weight and history, was spoken aloud in court. For many, it was the acknowledgement that Isabella's death wasn't just personal, but symbolic of a wider epidemic of violence against women. As the case gained momentum, Richard's carefully built facade collapsed further. Reporters dug into his past, uncovering failed ventures, debts quietly settled, whispers of connections to organized crime. Suddenly, the man who had once seemed untouchable looked very human, very vulnerable. Vanessa's image also shattered. Friends who once described her as magnetic now spoke of her recklessness, her drinking, her volatile temper. Some suggested jealousy played a role in her hostility toward Isabella. Others believed she was simply caught in Richard's shadow, willing to do whatever it took to stay in his orbit. Whatever the truth, her attempts to paint herself as uninvolved no longer held. For Isabella's family, none of it erased the loss. Her son, too young to fully understand, asked when his mother was coming home. Her brother Omar attended every hearing, every press conference, his voice steady but heavy with grief. She was more than this case, he reminded reporters. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister. She deserved better. And yet, in some way, Isabella had already begun to get that justice. The story that once threatened to disappear had become a symbol. A reminder that persistence mattered, that truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface, even when buried under lies. But trials are long, and justice is rarely straightforward. Richard and Vanessa both pleaded not guilty. Their lawyers promised to fight, to challenge the evidence, to argue that Isabella's death was tragic but not criminal. To the public, it sounded hollow. To prosecutors, it was expected. The cracks in their story had widened into fractures, and those fractures were becoming impossible to seal. Each new piece of evidence, each inconsistency, only deepened the chasm. For Richard and Vanessa, the facade of charm and control was gone. All that remained were two people standing before a storm they could no longer escape. And for Isabella, though her voice was silenced, her story continued to echo, in the streets where vigils were held, in the courtrooms where her name was spoken, and in the relentless pursuit of a truth that refused to stay buried. By the spring of 2023, the case of Isabella Reed had grown beyond the confines of Colorado. News networks across the country covered every development. For weeks, her face appeared on screens, a smiling young woman with chestnut hair, holding her son close, contrasted against mugshots of Richard Stanton and Vanessa Cole. The narrative was clear. This was not just a trial for two defendants. It was a test of whether justice could prevail when privilege and connections tried to bend the truth. The courthouse in downtown Denver became a stage. Each morning, crowds gathered outside, reporters with cameras, activists holding posters, ordinary citizens drawn to the case that symbolized something larger than itself. Some carried candles even in daylight. Others chanted her name. Justice for Isabella. Inside, the mood was different. Cold. Methodical. Courtrooms are not places of spectacle, despite the cameras outside. They are places where lives are dissected detail by detail, where truth is filtered through rules and evidence. The prosecution came prepared. They laid out their case piece by piece, constructing a timeline of Isabella's final hours. Witnesses who had seen her at dinner the night of October 30th testified she had been in good spirits, laughing and engaged. Friends described her as hopeful, planning her future, with no signs of despair. They dismantled the notion that she was unstable or suicidal, a claim the defense had tried to plant. Then came the surveillance footage. The grainy image of Richard in the garage was shown on a large screen. Jurors watched as he carried a concealed figure to his SUV. The timestamp was displayed clearly, the morning of October 31st. The room was silent as the prosecutor explained what everyone could see: Richard had lied. Isabella never walked out alive. The second autopsy report followed. Forensic experts described the blunt force trauma, the defensive wounds, the bruises across her arms and legs. They explained how the injuries could not be explained by a simple fall or by choking on alcohol. This was violence. Sustained. Intentional. When Vanessa's text messages were read aloud, the tone of the trial shifted. Jurors listened to her words: "We need to stay consistent. Don't say too much. We need proof she left." Each message sounded less like the words of a bystander and more like those of an accomplice. The defense countered. Richard's lawyers argued he had panicked, that he had made a terrible mistake but had not caused Isabella's death. They painted him as reckless, not murderous. Vanessa's lawyers insisted she was guilty only of poor judgment, that she had been manipulated by Richard's influence. They asked the jury to consider that both defendants had been intoxicated that night, that memory and perception were clouded. But the evidence was heavy, and the contradictions in their stories were glaring. The most emotional moment came when Omar Reed took the stand. He spoke softly, his voice breaking at times. He described his sister not as a victim, but as a mother, a dreamer, someone who had built her life against all odds. He held up a drawing made by Isabella's son, a picture of his mother smiling under a sun. "He keeps asking when she's coming back," Omar said. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Jurors looked down. Some wiped their eyes. The trial was not without tension. Defense attorneys challenged every piece of evidence, questioning procedures, suggesting contamination, trying to sow doubt. But each time, prosecutors returned to the core: Isabella's injuries, Richard's surveillance footage, Vanessa's messages. Facts outweighed speculation. Outside the courtroom, pressure mounted. National advocacy groups held rallies, reminding the public that Isabella's case represented a broader crisis. "Too many women," one speaker said, "are dismissed, silenced, and forgotten. But Isabella's voice will not be erased." Richard, sitting at the defense table, maintained his composure. He rarely reacted, even as damaging evidence was presented. Vanessa was less controlled. At times she whispered frantically to her attorneys, her eyes darting across the room, her hands restless. Her polished charm, once magnetic, now seemed brittle. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution delivered a narrative that bound all the pieces together. This was not an accident, they told the jury. This was a betrayal. Isabella trusted these people. She walked into that apartment alive. She never walked out. And instead of helping her, instead of calling for aid, Richard Stanton carried her body out like a piece of luggage, and Vanessa Cole helped him weave a web of lies. They didn't just fail Isabella. They tried to erase her. The defense urged caution. They told the jury not to be swayed by emotion, to focus only on facts. They argued that the state had not proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt, that the evidence could be interpreted differently. But by then, the story of Isabella Reed was no longer just lines in a case file. It was a human tragedy, seared into the minds of those listening. After weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. Outside, crowds waited, candles flickering against the courthouse steps. Inside, time seemed to freeze. For hours, then days, the jury weighed evidence. They watched the footage again. They read the messages again. They considered the bruises, the silence, the lies. And slowly, a consensus began to form. The Reed family sat together in the front row, Omar holding his nephew close. They braced themselves for what was to come. When the jury filed back in, the air was heavy. Richard and Vanessa stood, their attorneys by their sides. The foreman cleared his throat and read the words that would echo long after: guilty. Richard Stanton, guilty of homicide, guilty of tampering with evidence. Vanessa Cole, guilty of complicity, guilty of obstruction. The sentences would be determined in the months to follow. But in that moment, a weight lifted. Not entirely. Isabella would never return, but enough to know the truth had prevailed over lies. Outside, when the verdict was announced, the crowd erupted. Candles were held high, tears mixed with applause. "Justice for Isabella," they chanted. Her name carried into the night air, no longer silenced. In the end, the trial was not just about one woman's death. It was about a system forced to confront its failures. It was about a family's persistence. It was about the power of truth to cut through even the most carefully constructed facade. For Richard and Vanessa, the world they had built collapsed in a courtroom. For Isabella, the world she had dreamed of never came to pass. But her story would remain, told and retold, as both a warning and a reminder. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. The gavel came down, and with it, the trial of Richard Stanton and Vanessa Cole officially ended. But for Isabella Reed's family, for her son, and for a community that had watched every painful detail unfold, the echoes of her story were only beginning. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp with the chill of early spring. Hundreds had gathered, holding candles even in daylight, their flames flickering against the wind. When word of the guilty verdict spread, the crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in a release of tension, as though an entire city had been holding its breath. "Justice for Isabella." Voices rang out, mingling with the cries of those who had carried her name for months. For Omar Reed, the verdict was both everything and not nearly enough. He had fought from the very beginning, refusing to accept the first autopsy, refusing to let his sister's death be written off as an accident. He had stood at vigils, faced cameras, answered questions when all he wanted was silence. Now, he sat quietly on the courthouse steps, his sister's framed photo resting in his hands. The jury had spoken. The system, slow and flawed as it was, had finally caught up to the truth. But nothing could bring Isabella back. Her son was too young to grasp the full scope of what had happened. To him, his mother's absence was a wound that time could not yet explain. Relatives shielded him from the cameras, but even in his innocence he understood one thing: she was not coming home. The drawing he had made of her, smiling beneath a sun, had been shown in court. It was now folded carefully into Omar's jacket, a reminder of both innocence lost and the reason they had fought so hard. The case reverberated beyond the family. It raised uncomfortable questions about privilege, power, and the justice system. Why had the first autopsy ignored the bruises? Why had the Fremont County officials been so quick to label Isabella's death as accidental? Rumors of Richard's connections lingered, whispers of favors and influence. The state promised an investigation into possible misconduct, but many doubted accountability would reach that far. Still, Isabella's case had already changed something. Advocacy groups used her story as a rallying cry. Marches were organized, panels were held, and her name became linked to the broader movement against violence toward women. Across Colorado and later across the nation, her face appeared on posters and in speeches, not as a symbol of tragedy alone, but as proof that persistence could bend the system toward truth. For Richard Stanton, the fall was absolute. Once a man of wealth and charm, he now awaited sentencing in a prison cell. The polished facade that had drawn people in, the tailored suits, the easy smile, the quiet confidence, was stripped away. What remained was a man who had tried to erase a life and instead erased his own reputation. His sentence would likely keep him behind bars for decades, perhaps for the rest of his life. Vanessa Cole, too, faced the weight of consequence. Friends who once admired her turned away. Her attempts to paint herself as a victim collapsed under the weight of her own words. The jury had seen her not as an innocent bystander, but as a participant who chose loyalty to Richard over truth. She would serve her sentence, but her name was already etched into the story as part of the betrayal. Inside Isabella's small nail salon, the lights no longer flickered on each morning. The chairs sat empty, bottles of polish gathering dust. But in the window, taped carefully to the glass, someone had left a photo of her, smiling, alongside a note that read, "She mattered." Customers who had once come for manicures now came to leave flowers, to whisper prayers, to remember a woman who had turned her struggles into resilience. The lesson of Isabella's story was not simple. It was not about a system that worked perfectly, nor about justice that came swiftly. It was about the cracks in that system, the ease with which a life can be dismissed, and the relentless effort it takes to force the truth into the light. It was about family refusing to be silent, about communities demanding answers, about the role of persistence when institutions fail. Months later, at a memorial held on what would have been her 28th birthday, Omar spoke again. His voice was steadier this time, but his words carried the weight of loss. "She trusted people who betrayed her," he said. "But she also trusted us to fight for her. And we did. We couldn't save her life, but we saved her story. And no one can take that away." The candles lit that night glowed against the dark, a sea of small flames carried by strangers who had come to know Isabella through news stories, through vigils, through the echoes of her name. Some cried quietly. Others stood in silence. All of them understood that this was more than one case. It was a reflection of how fragile truth can be, and how much it takes to protect it. For her son, the years ahead would be shaped by absence. But he would grow up knowing his mother's story had mattered, that she had not been forgotten, that the world had spoken her name long after her voice was gone. In that way, perhaps, Isabella had achieved what she always wanted, to leave her son something better than what she had. Not wealth, not luxury, but the undeniable proof that her life had meaning. The echoes of her case would not fade quickly. Journalists continued to reference it when discussing systemic failures. Advocates cited it when lobbying for reforms. In Denver, people still pointed to the courthouse where her name had been spoken, where lies had unraveled under the weight of truth. And in quiet moments, on lonely highways, some remembered the image of where she was found, a young woman abandoned on the roadside, mistaken for just another accident. They remembered how that image had been rewritten by persistence, by courage, by the refusal to let her story end there. Isabella Reed's life had been one of struggle and hope. Her death was one of violence and betrayal. But her legacy was something else entirely, a testament to the power of truth, carried forward by those who refused to let it be buried.